Inferno, Sonata. Author Kim Dong-in. Readers can imagine the story I'm about to write as unfolding in some corner of Europe, or perhaps as a tale set in Korea 40 or 50 years from now. However, whether these events transpired on Earth, whether they exist, or whether they might exist, all of these remain uncertain possibilities. That's all you need to grasp for now. So envision the protagonist of my story, Baek Song-soo, as Albert, or maybe as Jim, or even as someone named Hao or Kimura. Just recognize that the character is human and the story occurs in the human world. With this premise, let's begin my story. Do you know that opportunity can both ruin and prosper people? Well, it's not a new issue to contemplate. Imagine there's a shop here. Currently, it's ownerless and unstaffed, completely empty. Now, if a gentleman passes by a person of wealth and fame, he might think upon seeing the empty shop. It's empty. Even a thief could easily enter. If they steal something, no one would know. Why leave it empty like this? With such thoughts, or perhaps a sudden deviant impulse, he might even pocket a small, seemingly insignificant item. Isn't that possible? Well, I'm not sure. It is possible. It happened on a summer evening. Two elderly men sat beside a suburban riverbank, far from the city, engaged in this conversation. The advocate of this theory of opportunity was Mr. K, a renowned music critic. The listener was Mr. Thingamajig, a social reformer. Do you think it's possible? It is. Let's assume it is. In such cases, where does responsibility lie? According to the Eastern proverb, don't tie your shoelaces in a melon field and don't adjust your hat under a plum tree. Would that gentleman take responsibility? If he does, that's one thing. But what if you believe the gentleman is decent and wouldn't have the heart, let alone the inclination, to act so were it not for such an unusual chance? The fault lies in the opportunity, and this intangible concept cannot be punished. Therefore, for now, we must acknowledge the gentleman as the perpetrator. That's true. Another thing is a man's genius sometimes permanently absent without opportunity, and if such opportunity were to simultaneously extinguish both his genius and his criminal instinct, should we curse or bless that opportunity? Well, I'm not sure. Sir, do you know someone named Baek Song-soo? Baek Song-soo? I can't recall. As a composer, oh, now I remember. The famous composer of the Inferno Sonata, right? Yes. Do you know where he is now? I don't know. There were rumors of him going insane. Yes, he's currently confined at Sang's mental hospital. Please listen to his story and share your opinion as a social reformer. The father of Baek Song-soo, whom I'm about to tell you about, was also a gifted musician. We were classmates, and even in our student days, his talent was abundantly evident. He majored in composition and would sometimes play the piano late into the night, unknowingly waking us with his compositions. We were captivated by the passionate melodies that filled the night. He was a wild man. His fierce nature sometimes led him into conflict, whether chastising a teacher if displeased, frequenting nearby taverns, or clashing with shopkeepers who dared not cross him. This wildness was deeply embedded in his music and paradoxically enhanced the brilliance of his artistry. However, after graduation, his wild nature took a different form. Alcohol. It was a terrifying presence. From morning to night and night to morning, the glass was never far from his lips. After drinking, he would cause disturbances with women, get detained by the police, and repeat the cycle endlessly. His works? What were they about? After drinking, he would sometimes sit at the piano and improvise tunes in his excitement. Looking back now, that eerie spirit, that wildness, could be considered a treasure not seen since Beethoven among modern composers. But we were all too absorbed in forging our own paths to document the improvisations of a drunkard. Such thoughts never crossed our minds. We would occasionally advise him to curb his drinking, thinking of his future. But what use was a friend's advice to such a wild man? Alcohol? Alcohol is music. He would laugh heartily and head back to the tavern. After 8 or 9 years of this, he became a complete wreck. His hands trembled without alcohol. His eyes were bleary, and when he did drink, his ferocity returned. He would grab anyone nearby and force alcohol down their throats, then collapse wherever he pleased. He was indeed a wasted genius. We birds sometimes sigh at the thought of his 1000th birthday, but the world didn't realize he harbored terrifying genius of the future. Meanwhile, he somehow became involved with a young woman from a respectable family, and she even bore his child. However, tragically, he passed away from a heart attack before he could witness the birth of his child. The posthumous child left behind by this man was Baek Song-soo. But we only heard rumors of Baek Song-soo's birth, and after his father's death, we knew nothing of his whereabouts or his mother's situation. In fact, it's more accurate to say that we completely forgot about that household's affairs. 30 years have passed. They say even mountains and rivers change in 10 years. So how can I describe the changes that have occurred over 30 years? During this time, I have built up my name. As you know, if you mention K now, am I not the foremost music critic in this country? Respected and authoritative, my words hold significant weight in the music industry, and many musicians have risen to fame under my guidance. It was a spring day 2 years ago. By then, spending hours in meditation at the Hyori Chapel during quiet nights had become a habit. Situated on a hill, the house stood alone. Apart from the occasional startled coo of a dove or the intermittent tapping of wood on the porch, it was silent. It was the kind of secluded and quiet house that even someone like me with peculiar habits would not enter even if offered money. However, for someone who enjoyed meditation, it was a house filled with everything one could need. The mysterious sounds occasionally emanated from afar, like the occasional startled sound of a train whistle, added to its charm. Moreover, this chapel even had a piano. While an organ might be expected in a chapel, finding a piano was a rarity, and it added to the enjoyment of playing a tune when the mood struck. That night, it must have been past 2 o'clock, as I sat alone in the chapel with my eyes closed, savoring the quiet, suddenly a rumbling sound echoed from below. Startled, I opened my eyes to a blaze of light, and as I looked down, I saw a house below the hill engulfed in flames, with people coming and going in commotion. It may sound strange, but there was something strangely fascinating about watching a fire not too far away. The rising flames, the spreading smoke, the sparks flying in the air, the faintly visible pillars amidst the chaos, the remains of the house, the bustling crowd, such scenes could indeed be considered artistic and musical. In ancient times, Nero is said to have played the lyre and sung while watching Rome burn, and from a musician's perspective, there was nothing inherently reprehensible about it. I too felt a surge of excitement as I watched the fire at that moment. Perhaps I should follow Nero's example and improvise a piece. Vaguely entertaining such thoughts, I was staring at the fire absent-mindedly. That's when it happened. Suddenly, there was a clattering noise, and the door of the chapel burst open, and a young man rushed in as if fleeing from something. Then, he glanced around as if startled by something, but still not noticing me. He hurried to the window on the opposite side, concealed himself, and peered out at the blazing fire below. I was frozen in place. Surely he couldn't be anything other than an arsonist or thief, right? Unable to move, I watched as he let out a sigh, then listlessly stretched out his arms and with a resigned air, dragged a chair over to the piano and sat down hesitantly. Intrigued, I watched as he opened the lid, played a tentative note, then another, and another. From that moment on, his breathing grew louder and louder. He trembled with excitement, then suddenly brought both hands down onto the keys with lightning speed. In the next instant, the allegro in C-sharp minor began. Initially, I was merely observing out of curiosity, but as the allegro resounded, my heart became increasingly tense and exhilarated. It was a pure primal sound, too powerful and unrefined to be called music. Yet, within it lay a tormenting and weighty emotion, as heavy and solemn as the tolling of a night bell, simultaneously invoking a terrifying expression of raw emotion, like the roar of a beast, sending shivers down one's spine. Oh, the primal force and masculine roar, the underlying hunger and pain, the innocent and unadorned expression beneath it all. I sank into my seat, compelled by the musician's instinct, and involuntarily pulled out a piece of manuscript paper and a pencil from my pocket. As the piano sounds unfolded, my pencil danced across the manuscript paper. Starting rapidly with poverty, hunger, and fading flames of life, passing through compressed emotions of a prolonged adagio, sudden bursts of frenzy. There were light moments of amusement, all concluding in a dominant harmony. Moreover, the compressed emotions, hunger, or fierce flames evoked a rawness in the human heart, reminiscent of a savage untouched by the refinement of civilization. Even after the sonata had concluded, I remained in a daze, unable to regain my senses. Any person with even a slight knowledge of music would recognize that the performance was merely an improvisation driven by his genius, devoid of any formal musical training. It was a reckless, uninhibited sonata, mixing diminished sevenths with augmented sixths, and even including forbidden parallel octaves. Furthermore, the scherzo was entirely improvised, making it a boldly adventurous and perhaps ignorant composition. At that moment, a sudden recollection crossed my mind. It was Baek-ou, who had died of a heart attack 30 years ago. If his music had been infused with traditional training and further enriched with primal instincts, it would have resembled the music I witnessed before me. The force that invaded the senses, the passionate expression, and the primal essence, these were treasures rarely found among modern musicians. Enthralled by the sonata, I sat bewildered for a while, then calmly rose and approached the piano, gently placing my hand on his shoulder. Startled, he looked up at me, his eyes wide with surprise. "How old are you?" I asked, my heart heavy with emotion, unable to think of anything else to say in that moment. He glanced at my face, illuminated by the moonlight streaming through the window, then turned away without a response. "Are you hungry?" I asked, attempting conversation once more. He jumped up suddenly as if startled, then turned to face me directly in the moonlit room. "Oh, are you Professor K?" he exclaimed, grasping my arm. Upon my confirmation, he let go without much enthusiasm. "I've seen pictures of you, but—" He trailed off, looking away. In that moment, as he turned his head and the moonlight briefly illuminated his face, I saw it clearly for the first time. And there, to my surprise, I saw the resemblance to my late friend, Baek-ou, who had passed away 30 years ago. "So, what's your name? Baek-song-su? Aren't you Baek-ou's son? He passed away 30 years ago before you were born." He lifted his head abruptly. How do you know, sir? Are you Baek-ou's son? You look just like him. We were classmates with your father." "Ah, yes, you must be his son." He sighed heavily and hung his head low. That night, I brought Baek-song-su home. Despite the unconventional composition that defied all norms, I couldn't bring myself to discard the sonata filled with such intensity, passion, and raw energy. Instead, I urged him to sit at the piano once more. The piece I had transcribed earlier was nearing its allegro conclusion, and I wanted to capture what came before. He sat at the piano, leaning in. He tapped the keys a few times, then leaned back, thoughtful. However, after several attempts, the sounds that emerged were mere irregular, discordant noise. There was no primal energy, no power, just the lingering echo of emotion. "Sir, it's not going well," he said, his head tilted shyly. "Forgetting it after less than 2 hours?" I nudged him aside and took his place at the piano, laying out the sheet music I had transcribed. Then I resumed from where I had left off. Flame, poverty, hunger, primal power, eerie trapped emotions. As I looked at the sheet music, I felt a surge of excitement. In that moment, my eyes must have gleamed like a madman's, my face flushed with anticipation. Suddenly, he rushed towards me, pushing me aside to take his seat. Stunned from falling off the chair, I sat there, unable to compose myself, watching him. He grabbed the sheet music, pushed me away, and began to read. Oh, his expression! His breath quickened. His eyes gleamed like those of a madman. Then, suddenly, he cast the sheet music aside, and his hands landed on the piano keys like lightning. The frenzied sonata in C-sharp minor began anew. That power, like a storm or a terrifying wave, overwhelmed me. It was a fierce primal energy unseen in contemporary musicians since Beethoven. The terrifying hunger, poverty, compressed emotions, erupting fury, fear, laughter. Oh, I was breathless, my hands involuntarily raised in astonishment. As the night progressed, he grew more animated, recounting his past in vivid detail. Based on his stories, his life unfolded roughly as follows. His mother was abandoned shortly after his birth, and they fell into poverty. Despite their circumstances, his cultured and wise mother raised him with grace. Though they had little, she managed to save up and buy him a reed organ, playing Schubert's lullabies to help him sleep, and Mendelssohn's Second Waltz to energize him for the day. At 3, he sat on her lap and played with the organ. Seeing his interest, she diligently saved to buy him a piano at 6. In the mornings, the sounds of birds, rustling poplar leaves, his mother's love, the bubbling of soup, everything was mysterious and tender to him. He would sit at the piano and play, tapping the keys as thoughts came to him. Despite hardships, he finished elementary and middle school, his longing for music growing. After middle school, for his mother's sake, he took up manual labor in a factory. Yet, under her guidance, he remained humble. His passion for music never waned. Despite lacking formal training, he earned by busking and singing in church choirs on Sundays, never leaving his piano at home. At times, he tried to notate music, but his passionate excitement turned into dull scales and chords on paper. Why? You may ask. I'll explain later. 10 years of excitement, frustration, passion, and creativity, alongside extraordinary enthusiasm and the disappointing results that followed, passed. Suddenly, his mother fell seriously ill. The money he had saved for her care and medications started dwindling. Despite saving for proper music education, hoping for a comfortable life, all the savings went into his mother's illness. However, her condition showed no signs of improvement. Then, one day in late spring or early summer, before we met at that church, his mother fell into an irreversible state of illness. By then, he had run out of money. That morning, he left his critically ill mother behind and went to the factory as usual. However, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't concentrate on work, so he returned home halfway through the day. By then, his mother was already in critical condition. Feeling his heart sink, he hastily rushed out again. But where to? What to do? He aimlessly ran out and ran for a while before suddenly coming to his senses and turning back, intending to ask a doctor for help. That was when the opportunity I mentioned earlier appeared before him. It was a small tobacco shop, with the door between the shop and the living quarters closed, and no one visible outside. On top of the cigarette case lay a few coins, including 50 Johns in silver, and a few copper coins. He didn't know what he was doing. With only a vague idea that he needed money to see a doctor, he quickly grabbed the money after glancing around once and bolted. But he hadn't taken 20 steps before someone grabbed him from the house he was fleeing. He tried to explain several times. Finally, he argued that his mother was critically ill, and if they let him go for just an hour, he could send a doctor to his mother and come back to surrender. But all such pleas fell on deaf ears, and he ended up being taken to the police station. From the police station to the courthouse, and from the courthouse to prison, during these 6 months, he was disheartened. He agonized over what had become of his mother. He bitterly regretted. If she passed away, how desperately she must have searched for him in her final moments. She was a mother who had no one to give her a sip of water even at her last moments. Thinking of her suffering, he too felt tormented and thirsty. 6 months later, when he finally emerged into the light of the world and went to find his lodging, he found that someone else was already living there, and his mother had crawled out onto the street 6 months earlier in search of her son and died there. He went to the public cemetery, but he couldn't even find a gravestone. With nowhere else to go, he wandered aimlessly and ended up finding his way to the church, where he met me that day, just as he had wandered there looking for a place to stay. At this point in the story, Mr. K suddenly paused. Then, he took out his tobacco pipe, lit it, and smoked while looking at Mr. Thingamajig. Have you not noticed any contradictions in the story I've told? Well, then let me ask instead. Baek Song-soo was a highly talented musician, but why is it that before composing the Inferno Sonata, he referred to it as the Inferno Sonata that night, no matter how excited and tense he got once he put it into sheet music, it became very feeble? Perhaps the excitement at that time wasn't as intense as when he composed the Inferno Sonata. Do you interpret it that way? Listening to it, that interpretation does make sense. However, I interpret it differently. How do you interpret it then, Mr. K? Instead of explaining my interpretation, I have a letter from Baek Song-soo that came to me, and I'll show it to you. Are you not busy today, sir? I have no engagements. Then would you like to come with me to my house for a moment? Let's go. The two old men got up. By the time they reached Mr. K's house on the outskirts of town, it was already late afternoon. They sat facing each other in Mr. K's study. This is the letter I received from Baek Song-soo 2 or 3 days ago. Please read it. Mr. K took out a bundle of long letters from a drawer and handed them to Mr. Thingamajig. He accepted and unfolded them. Wait, start reading from here. The previous parts are just pleasantries. And so, on that day, as I wandered around looking for a place to spend the night, I happened to reach the house where I had stolen 50 or so coins before. It was quiet around the house in the deep night light, and as I searched for a place to stay in front of the house, a terrifying thought of revenge arose in my mind. If it weren't for this house, if the owner had shown a little compassion, my poor mother wouldn't have had to crawl out onto the street and depart from this world. It's because of this house that I couldn't even find her grave, let alone bring a flower to it. Unable to bear such thoughts, I set fire to the straw covering in front of the house. After watching the fire move towards the house, I suddenly became afraid and ran away. As I ran a bit further, it seemed that people were already starting to gather below, but at that moment, all I could think about was the exhilaration of escaping. So I dashed into the nearby church to hide. After watching the fire until it was completely extinguished as I was about to leave, I saw the piano and... Look at this. Kay pointed out the letter to Mr. Thingamajig. The extraordinary passion and emotion were there, but they weren't fully expressed because of it. You see, Songsu's mother was a very virtuous woman who raised him to be kind and gentle from a young age, putting great effort into his education. Due to this good upbringing, his innate fiery and wild nature never surfaced outwardly. When that burning wild passion and energy were translated into sheet music, it became very weak, almost like diluted alcohol, and that's all because of that upbringing. I see. Songsu, despite washing himself once during his time in prison, couldn't completely wash away what you call human culture. Then, suddenly, in front of the enemy's house, his wild and fiery nature burst out, starting the fire and hiding in the church to revel in that wild pleasure before it exploded out of him, resulting in the Inferno Sonata. Rising flames, people's screams, the power of the spreading fire. These are the essence of wild pleasure. Have you understood? Then, from here on, read the letter again. The events of that day still feel fresh in my mind. The sight of you, my mentor, an elderly man sitting at the piano himself to perform my Inferno Sonata in front of several invited musicians, just to introduce me to the world, brings tears to my eyes even now. The guests, especially two ladies, fainting at that time was not solely due to the power of the Inferno Sonata, but also the impact of your performance. After that, they presented me in front of many people, introducing me with great emotion. This person is the composer of the Inferno Sonata and the son of Bakins, a genius who left us 30 years ago to pursue his own path. How can I ever forget the overwhelming emotions of that moment in my life? The room you prepared for me was perfectly suited to my taste. It was a spacious north-facing room with a sturdy oak bed in the southeast corner, a simple oak desk and chair in the northwest corner, and a piano. Other than that, there was only one large mirror on the south wall, giving the room an eerie atmosphere, especially at night under the dim light. Additionally, the room was painted in dark colors, and outside the window stood an old chestnut tree, adding to the overall eerie ambiance. In this way, you made every effort to encourage me to create unrestrained and bold music, allowing me to follow my own path without reservation. I, too, put in considerable effort to create good music in such surroundings. When I once asked you for systematic training in composition, you replied, "You don't need that kind of education. Create as you please. If someone like you receives systematic training, your music will become mechanical. Ignore all rules and norms and express what comes from your heart." I didn't fully understand your words, but I grasped the general meaning. Thus, I endeavored to pioneer the realm of freely expressive music. However, all the music I produced during that time, like before, when my mother was still alive, amounted to nothing more than feeble auditory playthings. How anxious I must have been. Sometimes your somewhat reproachful words only added to my anxiety, and the more anxious I felt, the weaker my music became. I often tried to recall the blazing scene of that day and relive the exhilarating emotions. Yet it always ended in failure. Sometimes after sketching out music with extraordinary passion, upon revisiting it hours later, I found nothing but feeble concepts. My heart grew heavier, and I couldn't help but feel sorry for you, who had such high hopes for me. Music isn't like a craft. It doesn't come to fruition whenever you want. It blossoms when inspiration strikes. During those days, the words of comfort from you felt like they were gnawing at my soul. However, my inner state made me feel as if there would never be another opportunity for powerful music to come from me again. Several months passed without any notable events. One night, in the midst of profound heaviness in my chest, as if it were filled to the brim with something, I ventured out for a walk. With a heavy head, heavy heart, and heavy legs, I aimlessly wandered until I stumbled upon a large haystack. I cannot describe the state of my mind at that moment. I felt tense and excited, as if encountering some formidable enemy. After scanning the surroundings once, I rushed to the haystack and set it ablaze. Suddenly overwhelmed by fear, I turned and ran, fleeing until I could run no more. Looking back from a distance, I saw flames already reaching for the sky. Cries of people could be heard in the distance. I returned to the scene, mesmerized by the sight of the haystack burning and the successive houses collapsing. It excited me, and I returned home in a state of exhilaration. That night gave birth to the raging waves. Subsequently, several fires broke out in the neighborhood, all of which I had ignited, and on each night of the fires, I gained one piece of music. During the days of heavy-heartedness, when it became unbearably suffocating, I involuntarily roamed the streets. On such nights, arson incidents occurred, and a new piece of music was born each time. But as the number of fires increased, my excitement about them diminished proportionally. The cruelty of the flames, unforgiving of everything, failed to stir my heart much. It seems to be losing its power little by little, you remarked upon seeing my music during those times. However, I had no choice. I had to let go of music entirely for a while, as if I had forgotten it altogether. When Mr. Thingamajig read up to this point of Songsu's last letter, Kay found it. Last spring through autumn, there were many unexplained fires, weren't there? It was Songsu's prank. Did you not know about it at all? I didn't. But it was on one of those nights. It had been several months since Songsu came to our house, but he never produced anything substantial. So I was thinking to myself, what could I give him to get excited about? And then, on that particular night, over there, quite a distance away, I noticed a fire burning, Kay said, pointing to the southern window. So I thought, if I showed it to Songsu, it might revive his emotions from that time. At that moment, I didn't even dream that the fire at the tobacco vendor's house was also Songsu's doing. I was about to go up to Songsu's room to show him, but suddenly I heard piano music coming from his room. I paused my steps, feeling hesitant. It started with a C sharp, the main theme, quiet and gentle C, evening sun trying to cross the horizon, gradually turning into a squall, storm, lightning, terrifying sound of the wind, thundering, a shipwreck, terrified cries of the people, excitement upon excitement, frenzy upon frenzy, all sorts of horror and brutal scenes flashing before my eyes. I couldn't bear the excitement anymore and unintentionally shouted, "Stop it, just that alone should give you a hint." And when I went up, he had finished the performance and was sitting tiredly leaning against the piano, and the music he just played was already written down as Raging Waves. So Songsu set fire twice and obtained 2 pieces of music? Yes. And then, from then on, he started composing one piece after another every 10 days or so, which looking back now was created every time there was an arson incident. But, according to his letters, after some time, his power and ferocity gradually diminished. So, wait a moment. Didn't he also create Melody of Blood and several other famous pieces after that? Well, I'm not sure. Let me check the letter again. If you read from here, you'll see. I attempted to emerge from beneath the bridge when something ensnared my foot. Lighting a match to investigate, I discovered it was the body of an elderly man. Startled, I initially tried to flee, but inexplicably turned back. And now, teacher, do you comprehend my writing? It was so bizarre that even I struggled to believe it. I sat upon the corpse. Stripping away its garments, I scattered them about. Then, with an unearthly strength, which I did not think was my own, I hoisted the naked corpse high and hurled it to the other side. Thereafter, like a cat toying with a mouse, I dashed over, seized the corpse, and flung it back to this side of the road repeatedly. I continued until its head cracked, its belly burst, rendering the corpse truly ghastly to behold. Exhausted from my exertions, I sat down to rest, but suddenly my heart raced and excitement seized me, prompting me to dash home. That night, Melody of Blood was conceived. Do you grasp this mindset? Well, I'm uncertain. Perhaps not, but as an artist, one can appreciate such a mindset. Also, read this passage. The unexpected death of the woman deeply affected me. That night, I clandestinely visited her grave alone. Before midnight, I unearthed her body from the earth where it had rested for 18 hours. Under the shimmering moonlight, her graceful figure lay there like a fairy. With gently closed eyes, her pale face, straight nose, disheveled black hair, her serene expression added to her allure. As I gazed at her without any rational thought, I suddenly felt exhilarated, and, oh teacher, I lack the courage to detail further here. Consult the court records to comprehend. That night, Spirit of Death was born. What are your thoughts? Yes? Nonsense? From your perspective, perhaps. Read this section as well. Finally, I reached the point of taking a life. With each death, a melody was born. Henceforth, every composition of mine encapsulated the life of its subject. There is no more to read, but having read this far, you should have some grasp of Songsu's predicament. What is your opinion on it? Yes, what opinion do you seek? When an individual, along with their genius, unleashes their criminal instincts, should we condemn or applaud that opportunity? Regarding Songsu, he committed arson, desecrated corpses, committed murder, and engaged in various other crimes. Our artist community did everything possible to petition authorities and the court to confine Songsu to a psychiatric hospital on grounds of insanity. Otherwise, he faced imminent execution. Yet, even after reading his missive, one can infer his usual intelligence, courtesy, and gentleness. However, sporadically, his excitement drives him to commit horrific crimes, followed by the creation of remarkable art. In such instances, should we abhor the crimes or pardon them in light of the art they produce? Wouldn't it be preferable if he created art without committing crimes? Undoubtedly. Yet, given the existence of individuals like Songsu, how should we address such cases? We must hold the crimes accountable. We cannot simply overlook the wrongdoing. Kay nodded. Indeed. Nevertheless, from an artist's standpoint, we can view it differently. Since Beethoven, music has gradually lost its vigor, fixating on celebrating flowers, women, and love rather than forging new paths. Moreover, stringent compositional rules have stifled all freedom in music, transforming subsequent works into exercises of skill rather than expressions of art until a new direction emerges. Artists find this stifling. Potent art, profound art, art infused with wildness. This is what we have long awaited. And then Bak Songsu appeared. In truth, every piece of art Baek Songsu has crafted is a treasure that will forever illuminate our culture. It stands as a monument to our civilization. If a few mundane crimes are the price for his art, it is assuredly not in vain. Is it not a graver sin to erase from this world a genius of perhaps a millennium, maybe an era, under the guise of minor transgressions? At least, this is how our artists perceive it. Kay accepted the letter from the elderly man across from him and placed it in his drawer. In the reddish glow of the setting sun, tears shimmered in his aged eyes. Published in 1929,